rock, most people enjoy a good story. Imagine a story where you rock. Are you doing something rocking in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, or the world? I would love to have you on my show to share your rocking stories. We are here with Amy Jo Ehman, and author and historian. Welcome to my show.
Thank you, Marian. Thanks for having me.
So how did you get started writing about historical kinds of writing and food?
Well, let's see. I grew up on a farm here in Saskatchewan, but I went to the city, went to university, got a job, and suddenly I was like a working gal buying all my groceries from the grocery store, and I thought, I've really felt out of touch with the foods of my childhood growing up on the farm at Craig. And so I set a project for myself, this was 2005 now, that for a whole year I just wanted to eat the foods of Saskatchewan. And for me it was a learning process, because if you had to do it, then you would search them out, you would find them, you would bring them into your house. It was a lot harder back then because there weren't websites and things like that, or year-round farmers markets where you could shop like that. So that project was a wonderful way of really exploring what we have in Saskatchewan now and where it comes from and who's doing it. And a lot of adventures went into that.
I bet. So what were some of the adventures?
Oh, well, for instance, down the spice trail of Saskatchewan, you know, there are spice farmers in Saskatchewan, and they grow spices on huge tracts of land, you know, fields like coriander and caraway and cumin, you know, some of these that we think maybe are exotic, but they grow really well here. So, and the way that adventure started is because I wanted to make my mom's pickles, and I wanted an all Saskatchewan pickle spice. So I started thinking, what do we have here, you know? So that was an interesting adventure, going north and learning to pick the mushrooms and what mushrooms are safe and which aren't, and some of the,
So you're exploring Saskatchewan, but through food,
but
the
through
idea of food. So tell us about that. Tell us about what you discovered.
That was such a wonderful experience. You know, I grew up on the plains. Picking Saskatoon berries was something from my earliest days. It's like something I do. I didn't even know we had blueberries in Saskatchewan growing up. Isn't that crazy? And yet the northern forests are full of blueberries and mushrooms. So I was really discovering the entire province, not just the part that I grew up in, the plains of Saskatchewan. And also, since I grew up, there's lots of new crops now. We have Saskatchewan cherries to explore now. We have all the pulses, you know, the chickpeas and lentils and those sorts of things weren't being grown by Saskatchewan farmers when I was a kid growing up on the farm. Although, when I was writing my second book, which was sort of like pioneer times and older in Saskatchewan, and the food culture in the early days and the recipes that the pioneers brought with them, I discovered that pioneers from Lebanon and Syria were here in the early days, and they were growing lentils long before the rest of our farmers picked up on it.
Well, that's why I wanted to have you on my show, because you rock, because you're preserving and recognizing and pointing out these facts for us about. And so let's just talk about your second book here, or bestseller, Out of Old Saskatchewan Kitchens, a beautiful book. So tell us about what's in this book.
I start out that book by what I wanted to do is retell the history of Saskatchewan through the lens of food. Because when you think about why was the province of Saskatchewan created, it was to, in the beginning, grow wheat. Wheat was the economic engine of Saskatchewan and for a while Canada back in the early days. So food has been important to us from the beginning, but you can't live on a land without food being important back in as long as there were people here, right? They're trying to feed their families. How did we do it? Through the fur trade, the First Nations, the Métis, and how did that create conflict between those families who were on this land and the new families who are coming out here, or particularly the governments who are trying to bring new families out here to live on this land and become farmers? It's a really fascinating story in which one can draw in the Northwest resistance of the Métis, the signing of the treaties. All of those stories can be told through the lens of food and how people were feeding their families here on this land. And then I looked at the different cultural groups that came to populate this land, the settlers to farm here, up till about the 1920s, you know, maybe First World War and a little afterwards, and how they were able to take the recipes from their homelands and kind of adapt them to what was available here, because everything wasn't available to them here when they got here. And then those recipes that were the touchstones that have come to this day through those families that they still cherish at special family occasions and community events.
So what were some of your family recipes that maybe were important to you?
My ancestors on my father's and my farming side are German, but they lived for several generations in Russia, the part of Russia that is now Ukraine, down by the Black Sea. So, there's a mix, you know. So, and then we live on a farm in Saskatchewan, so the big gardens, so cabbage and crab apples and potatoes like crazy. Those are the things that characterize the meals that were on the table when I was a child. So when I think of my grandma on that side, I'm thinking apple pies and applesauce cookies and those sorts of things. Very different. You know, I was an adult before I ate a pierogi. So that was not part of my cultural heritage, and yet that's so important and so iconic here in Saskatchewan as well. So tracing the pierogi trail, or if we want to be true to Ukrainians, the Vareniki trail, you know, that, you know, like we have different words for the same things in different cultures.
Exactly. Yeah, and my mom has called it padahe. So there's different ways of saying things and that, but they're all important. And, you know, there's a lot of similarities between culture and food too, which is what I've discovered. So tell us about your first book here. So this is Prairie Feast, A Writer's Journey Home for Dinner. So what does this book contain?
That was my adventures in going out in Saskatchewan and looking for the foods that we produce here now today. So whereas out of old Saskatchewan Kitchens is sort of former times, this is very contemporary. What we have here today, where we find it, you know, and stories about how we eat here, you know, from farmers markets and fall suppers, or are they foul suppers, you know, rink burgers and harvest dinners. You know, some families still have a tradition of nice, warm, hot dinners in the fields at harvest time. So I followed those trails, and yeah, so each chapter sort of looks at a different food per se, and then just you know, stories from my life and my contacts with people. I tried to make it very light and humorous. Of course, my message is eat local, but I didn't want to hit anybody over the head with it. I just wanted to make it seem fun and a celebration of what we have here. You know, we don't have everything, but what we have is wonderful, and there's a lot that you can do with it.
Well, it is, and your books are wonderful, and I thank you for being on my show and sharing your knowledge, because it's so important to preserve and share knowledge.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I hope you enjoyed today's show with Amy Jo Ehman. Thanks for rocking in and having a conversation with Marion. I'm Marion, and you rock.